Alex Vespestad and Meredith
Yeah.
Stedman of Tenderfoot Labs, welcome to AV123. It's wonderful to have you on the show, Alex, because you're co-founder and president of the company. Let me ask you this first, okay? Why in the world call yourselves Tenderfoot?
Well, actually, we are the production services arm of our parent company, Tenderfoot TV. So
Okay,
Tenderfoot TV was founded by Payne Lindsay and Donald Albright in 2016 with the launch and kind of lucky strike of Up and Vanished, which
yeah,
Meredith was around for and a producer on. And I came into the picture. We'll get back to the Tenderfoot thing. I came into the picture in around 2018, 2019, working on a missing persons case with the New York Times bestselling author Neil Strauss. And we were covering the case in real time, kind of just being sleuth detectives, people who had a care for wanting to know what happened, bring closure to the victim's family and loved ones, and just fell into this space of true crime and storytelling in
yes,
audio. Fell in love with it. And we partnered with the team at Tenderfoot to release that podcast, which became To Live and Die in LA. And after working with the team at Tenderfoot and just kind of the edge they had in wanting to always push the boundaries in the space, move the needle on a story, there was just so much excitement in working with them. I worked with them as an independent producer for about 5 years. And then a year and a half ago, after having done a few projects for Tenderfoot with them as originals, but also servicing other clients who liked the way Tenderfoot told stories, especially limited series in audio, we said, let's put a real focus on this. Let's
mm,
bring kind of my background and talents and merge it with the resources of Tenderfoot, and let's offer it as a service to anyone who wants to kind of explore the podcasting space with our bit of style and flavor. So Tenderfoot Labs, that's why I think you mentioned it. It seemed young. Tenderfoot Labs we
mm.
launched a year and a half ago. But Tenderfoot, the name, Meredith would know the history on that.
Yeah, I was about to say, Alex, do you know the history? You might have been
Think
told
I've
a
heard
while ago.
bits and pieces of lore. Yeah.
Okay, so the reason it's called Tenderfoot is because Payne, one of the co-founders, it was the highest rank he had achieved in the Boy Scouts, and Tenderfoot is the
Okay,
lowest rank, if
yes,
I'm not mistaken. So
yes,
it
yes,
was like an underdog kind of
okay,
name. And at the time when Tenderfoot started with two, slowly became three people, and then it was like four people for a few years.
yes.
So it was a very much of an underdog, bare bones operation.
Wow. Okay, that's fascinating. It's always interesting to find out how people get together and start something as extraordinary as you have done, and with the work you do. But Meredith, now that we can officially bring you in as senior producer, right? Tenderfoot Labs. Let me throw a real humdinger of a question at you. Tenderfoot Labs develops, produces, launches, and markets shows, right? So you're kind of like a one-stop shop. Now, having said that, let's talk about the attention economy because it's becoming more and more crowded out there. So, what do you do as senior producer to cut through the clutter and get the programs that you make heard?
That's a great question. That's a really great question. I do agree. It's really hard in the space right now, as I'm sure you know. It seems everyone has a podcast. I feel like it kind of boomed in 2020 when everyone was sitting at home and everyone realized, hey, I can Amazon myself a mic. So I think luckily Tenderfoot TV as the parent company had been around for a few years and had established, ourselves a little bit by that time, just a little bit. It was 2016, so it was still pretty young. But I think one of the things that's very helpful is like having our own ecosystem of shows. So we are able to promote every new show on our currently existing shows, and having that ecosystem and knowing like, okay, listeners from this show will like this new property. Let's try to market to this listenership pool. And I think that has been extremely helpful in launching new shows, especially as the space has just gotten more and more crowded. So I think there's just some creative placement and trying to do crossover episodes and trying to know what does our audience really like, so that every new property we're bringing in can kind of be funneled somewhere, and we can be giving people the stories and the content that they like based on what we already see them listening to.
Yeah. Tell me, Alex, just to get you back as co-founder and president of the company, right? What is the biggest challenge, without your thinking too hard, but what is the biggest challenge you faced while building Tenderfoot Labs? And quite frankly, how did you overcome it?
I think honestly the biggest challenge was just finding our first partners, kind of diving in, especially since we were coming out of COVID, coming out of a period after the strikes. And, it was like, okay, what do we, where do we want to bring our expertise to? And it was, are we going to talk with brands and help them build a podcast, and kind of what's the story we could maybe bring to their product or their service without, shoving it down a consumer's throat, but how could we tell something interesting while bring some promotional value to them? And it was like, was that the angle we want to go down, or where do we want to take our skills to the entertainment side? And after kind of just talking and discussing about it internally, eventually we kind of went with that entertainment route, and we narrowed in on like, what is our skill set, what are we really good at? And we're storytellers,
Yes.
we're creators of hooky juicy drama in audio, but also
Okay, juicy drama. I love that.
and,
All
and
right.
also able to put, when you're not expecting it, you're learning something.
Yeah.
We can educate you, we can bring a message, we can push an audience and advocate, whether that's a nonprofit or a group. And so we had general discussions with a ton of studios, a ton of great partners with IP, and it was narrowing in on, and I think a lot of people were trying to figure out, this was 2023 towards the end of it, what are we doing in audio?
Yeah.
And it felt like there were some really straightforward, kind of generic. Excuse me, real quick. I think I'm getting a knock at the door. Is that okay? Okay. I'm sorry
Meredith,
to
let
pause
me
Well, I'll pick it up.
throw this throw this question at you while Alex
One
is
sec.
attending
Yeah.
the door. Hooky, juicy drama.
Yeah.
Explain that to me.
Alex said it pretty well. And I think
Yeah.
it's because it goes across like a lot of our shows. So what Alex
Yeah.
mainly focuses on, of course, is, our, as like the founder of Labs, is, outside stories that we bring in. And then we also have originals, our TV umbrella. But what
Yeah.
goes across all of them, whether they're true crime, horror, politically based, whatever it is. And we're kind of slowly expanding into some comedy, into like dabbling, trying to do more fiction. But everything that we kind of do under Tenderfoot, no matter what, is, high production value,
Yes.
very much high storytelling value. We don't really specialize in any kind of like chatty podcasts, mostly not really conversational. We have like a couple here and there, but really we do kind of narrative deep dives. So we're scripting, we're doing lots of interviews. We're really crafting everything almost like docu style for
Right.
our unscripted stories, and everything ends up, with all that care, ends up being very hooky and juicy.
Yeah.
But we definitely pride ourselves on being that like creative one-stop shop for
Yes.
head-hitting stories.
And whether it's limited or whether it's a chatty show like Meredith hosts, she hosts one of our longest running chatty shows, Rattled and Shook. We want to try to find a way to innovate it and still be efficient, something
Yes.
that's not taking more time, but bringing a fresh new experience to. So coming back full circle, I think we were looking at the space, and especially talking with entertainment partners, I was like, there's a straight companion. We go behind the scenes, talk to
Yeah.
talent and crew, how a show got made. There's unlimited, let's tell a story behind the story. There's just a talk show, let's just make 12 to 30 episodes talking with different people behind the scenes. And we had this amazing opportunity at the end of 2023 where HBO, we were having a discussion with them, and they said, well, we're reviving True Detective. And I
Okay.
remember my light going off like, well, one, I think all the Tenderfoot team is heavily inspired by those first couple seasons of True Detective. It,
Yeah.
just like
100%.
resonated with us. It's just one of the best scripted crime things that's out there. And I think even it's what inspired Payne to go chase the first case of Up and Vanished. So I was like, we got to do something with this. And then just lo and behold, this new season, which was show run by a new director, Issa Lopez, they were kind of taking a fresh new take, and they were going to take it up to the Arctic cold. It was all set in Alaska and dealing with some MMIP missing persons cases, missing and murdered Indigenous persons, which we've covered before. So, and then just by serendipity, one of our upcoming seasons of Up and Vanished was covering real cases of MMIP in Nome, Alaska. So I was like, okay, there's some synergy here we can tap into. And let's ask HBO if we can talk with the producers. Let's ask if we talk with the showrunners. Let's figure out like the most interesting things that inspired them to make this new season and put a
Yeah.
twist on it. And instead of just doing the straight behind the scenes talking, with the videographer and the sound guy and the writers, like, can we get real people from Alaska whose lives parallel the stories going on in the show and create something really unique? And we put that together with the HBO team. We drafted it. We started some initial outreach to experts and advocates and sheriffs and people who had been detectives in Alaska. And things just kind of started to fall together. We also had resources from everything we were doing on the ground in Alaska with our Up and Vanish team. And we brought that in, and we were able to create something I think that was really special, that not only kind of highlighted the series and took it to this next immersive level, but anyone who was coming from True Detective watching it to the podcast, or vice versa, you could have listened to the podcast and just been fascinated to then go watch the series. You got to hear real voices of real people and hear their stories. And I think it was just a powerful thing we got to put together earlier this year. So that has kind of inspired us since launching that in February to be like, okay, what else can we do? What else can we go after? And we're in discussion with a couple different partners right now, and just kind of taking that fresh, innovative energy and bringing it to everything.
Yeah. Meredith, here's a question for you that Alex mentioned, fresh and new. As senior producer, where do you find fresh and new these days?
Ooh, that is hard. That's hard. Yeah, fresh and new. That's tough because I think my answer is a little bit different across different genres, probably.
Yes.
But I think, kind of echoing Alex, I think what we've been trying to do is keep the form fresh and new, to keep the listening experience fresh and new. As Alex said, I host one of the our more conversationally based shows, and it's a horror show. We do scary stories. We tell
Ooh.
basically true scary stories. Yes, it's fun.
Yeah.
It's fun. But it's like all listener generated, essentially. Like, people write in and tell us their scary stories. Sometimes they'll tell them in their own voice. Sometimes we get a voice actor to do it. But we have found that a lot of podcasts do that. So what will make us stand out? We tried to really lean into finding like an old radio variety show sound aesthetic,
Yes.
with all of our interstitial music, with every sound effect we use. We honestly tried to do a new kind of marketing approach. We tried to make our visuals really different. So even if it's just small tweaks in the feedback we see, it's made a difference where people are like, this feels a little different than what I'm normally used to hearing. And it's honestly a lot to do with our scoring, the soundscapes we pick and the kinds of stories we'll feature. And I think that goes for all of our shows. And fresh and new, I mean, we're always looking for great stories. We get a ton of emails in with lots of cases, and we try to go for stories that are not featured as much, things we haven't quite seen before, things we think we can make a real impact on in our true crime space. But we're always looking for interesting stories and things that we think we could maybe elevate and have set apart with what makes us Tenderfoot, which I think is a lot to do with sound, premium quality,
Yeah.
and just try to taking swings. taking swings.
And Meredith and April, the other hosts, are always experimenting with that show, trying new stuff. She says
Yeah.
it's like spooky, scary stories.
Yeah.
They did some sleep stories a
Yeah.
couple episodes ago. So like totally left turn, just unexpected to keep the feed fresh with new stuff.
We did some bedtime stories to go to sleep too, even though they were a
Oh,
little
really?
creepy. Yeah,
You both mentioned the term series. So let me ask you this. Limited series podcasting is becoming more and more and more popular. Why is that?
Meredith, you want to jump in?
For limited series, well, I think one thing that this is what I believe. I think that there are a lot of podcasts out there. Most people I think come to podcasting, or a lot of people come to podcasting for the daily commute to listen to their favorite people. Like
Yeah.
maybe you love the celebrity that hosts XYZ podcast. A lot of people come for those kinds of podcasts, but there is another set of that audience that wants, like, it's almost like a film or TV experience. And I really think some people appreciate the beginning, middle, and end of limited series. It hooks you. You know
Yes.
it's going somewhere. You know it's going to end in 8 episodes, and you really want to get to that conclusion. And I think there's definitely that drive. There's definitely that like kind of almost bingeable addiction factor. You want to get
Yes.
to the end, discuss it at work. You want to recommend it to people. And so I think there's always been that with limited series. And I think also right now there's the IP factor. There's the factor of like maybe this could be adapted to TV. And we've seen it happen, with Dr. Death and Dirty John and all the most popular kind of limited series. They get adapted and then a whole new audience turns out for those properties. So I think there's always the hope that like your limited series will hit the zeitgeist just right and you'll be, the next Dr. Death or Dirty John, and
Yes.
it'll just be turned out. And I don't know, I think there's something really interesting about the stories that everyone ends up listening to. But yeah, I kind of think that's it.
It is interesting too. There's a pro and con to this, but the amount of people, just out in daily life, introducing myself and networking and meeting new people, telling them what you do. And then you bring up the word, well, I work in podcasting, could mean so many different things to a variety of people. For some people, like, oh yeah, I listen to podcasts, and to them, you're not even speaking the same language. I'm thinking in my head, yeah, I make, these 10, 12 episode shows, and they're thinking I listen to a 4-hour interview, every week, or a comedy show or politics. And then to some people on a completely other spectrum, it means, watching clips of a podcast on YouTube. It's totally different. The term podcasting has just taken on so many forms, but I guess what I'm trying to come back to is I often find myself explaining, okay, no, actually, I do true crime podcasts. Oh, okay, like, anthology, scary story. No, what we do is we get in the field. We do real investigation. A lot of it's, nonfiction. I explain it a lot, like Meredith said, like a docu-series. And they've never heard of any sort of podcast or experienced or listened to a podcast like that. So it's like a book, it's like an audio book. Well, no, it has all these voices, and it feels like it has chapters, but we weave in, writing and music and some sound effects sometimes to really make you feel like you're there and a part of it. Oh, whoa, okay, I'll have to check that out. And then I can't tell you how many times after some of our shows I've sent to now friends of mine who had never experienced it, they'll message back a week later, say, I binged it. I listened to the whole thing.
Okay.
What else do you have? What else is out there? And discoverability is becoming a trickier thing now, but I think there is a reason why there's always like a limited series in the top 10 on the Apple podcast charts. I think there's 2 up there now, but I think there's a hunger. There's definitely a hunger for more of these stories, and they are fascinating. They're somewhere between, a book and a film, or a book, you leave your mind open to so much more to imagine and fill in the space, right? But you're given just a little bit more texture. It's an interesting experience. I find them personally, I love them for road trips. That's why I listen to my limited series.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we're constantly finding more listeners and people who haven't ever experienced what a limited series is every year, every quarter. So
As a sheer matter of interest, Meredith, Have you been able to determine how many episodes is a good limited series?
That's interesting. I think that's changed. I'm also interested what you think, Alex. But I think that's changed over time. Like we had our first limited series, 20 plus episodes, and then it kind of kept going before we even turned over to doing a season two. We had a lot of episodes.
And 40-minute,
Um,
40-minute, 45-minute episodes.
Yeah, that's
wow.
long. Yeah.
But it was the first one that Tenderfoot had that was Up and Vanished season one. And I don't think there was really a game plan there. There was no end, and it was produced in season, like as it was happening. There was no pre-production. It was like, hello, this week's episode is what happened this week. So that is not necessarily what we technically mostly do anymore. But I think right now we're kind of mostly doing somewhere between 8 and 12. I
Okay.
think that tends to be, sometimes it can go a little shorter, more like 6, but I think it's usually 8 to 12, probably 8 to 10 being the average. And I think that's where we're seeing the most effective kind of listener retention. And usually also, I think it really matters on the story. Like, don't
Yes.
push having more episodes if the story is done in fewer. I think that is only probably a sales move, candidly, to have more episodes, sell more on, some more ads on them. But I think truly what I'd rather see in a creative production role is fewer episodes, better storytelling. And then you can have bonuses, and then you can have season two, whatever it is. But honestly, just whatever the story calls for. And I think that's 8 to 10 usually.
Interesting that you should mention even numbers only. So in other words, there's not
Yeah.
a 5 episode.
I'm sure there are. I mean, I'm sure there are. I don't know that we've done a 5, but we may have done a 5.
Or a 7.
We've definitely done 6.
Or a 9.
Yeah, we definitely we stick with even numbers.
There's something about a story arc that always feels like
Yeah.
it caps really well at 5, and then it needs just like that little bit of epilogue.
Yeah. Okay.
Like, I
Yeah.
don't know what it is.
Yeah.
Just always have found it to work out that way. Yeah, I don't know why we've never done an odd number one.
What do you think, Alex, in terms of the sweet spot? Do you think 8 to 10?
Yeah. We've done a companion series with Netflix. Meredith and I did
Yep.
there was a documentary for the Sons of Sam, and we did a 4-part, which was an interesting angle because the director of the series had a personal tie into the story, which
Right.
didn't make the documentary on Netflix, but it was fascinating. His personal journey and perspective felt like a story needed to be told, but so much was already being told in the documentary. Well, we didn't want to, extend it more than it needed to be. So how can we can tell a little bit more just tightly. But yeah, it's hard. I've listened to some really, really great 4-episode story podcasts. I've listened to some awesome 10, 12 episode ones, but it's just like Meredith said, it comes down to the story. It
Yeah.
comes down to how many twists and turns, how many kind of cliffhangers are there that's going to have an audience member hooked to, they're dying to hear the next one. They get home from work and the episode's got 10 minutes left. And so they just sit in their car and keep listening. Those are the stories you want. And those are what we're looking for.
Tell me something. It's quite an interesting debate, and I've heard a lot of answers that swing either way. But in terms of podcasting, which do you prefer, audio or video?
Ooh. Well, I'll say for me, audio.
Yeah.
I'm an audio purist.
Likewise, interestingly, yes. And you, Alex, you seem to be a little more doubtful. I could see your eyes glaze there for a moment.
Yeah, well, I understand the importance of video now.
Yeah.
With what we do, especially in our limited series, they get to be pretty intricately produced. So they have, there's voiceover, which is recorded most of the time after our interviews are done. So interviews you could shoot, but then there's this creative angle of, okay, how would you incorporate voiceover? I guess in my mind, I'm talking like, how could we eventually get to a point where we're having an incredible video component with our limited series?
And that's just making a documentary, I think, at that point.
That's making a documentary, and then the dollar signs go up, and then it just becomes an extra step. But I think they're, with the advent of kind of all the new AI and some graphics you could drop in and stock footage, there's going to be a way at some point to do it really efficiently and really fast. I think all chat shows now should be video. I think they should. Like it's
Yes.
just there's something about it, it's almost like I think about when you're watching like a comedy show on Netflix, like someone's stand-up series, right? There's something you miss by not seeing the facial expressions,
Yeah.
by not really fully embracing that person's personality and their being. So, you're missing body language. And I think that's something not a lot of people recognize the importance of. But podcasting started as audio. There's a power there completely.
Yes.
And I'm with Meredith. I love it. I'm an editor on the team. I haven't edited in a while, but there is something about piecing a story together just audio wise. And again, it comes back to that you're leaving so much blank space for the imagination to fill in. I think there's something special about that we shouldn't take away.
Yeah.
We should
Agreed.
lean into.
Now,
Yeah.
Meredith, you called yourself an audio purist, which I couldn't do more than concur with. But what are the current limitations that you've discovered in podcast storytelling that need to be addressed or broken through to keep the
Mm.
medium fresh and innovative as our audiences evolve?
Yeah, that is very interesting. My mind first goes to limited series and honestly, even just like experimentation. I think that could be fiction, nonfiction. I think that the radio drama of it all, it can be a little like with when you don't have visuals, you have to rely on voiceover often to kind of like
Yes.
orient the listener in the story. And I think that that makes a lot of sense. But sometimes I think we try to drop people into a scene with just sound design and see
Yes.
how that works. Again, this is coming from the audio purist side. And
Yes.
we have some phenomenal sound designers at Tenderfoot that love to do this kind of thing. And I think we're trying to experiment with it more. Like, could you actually drop people into a scene? Could you just use voice actors for a whole section? Do you have to voice over everything? I feel like playing with form and timing, taking swings, making something that feels a little bit more meta. I think that those are things we're kind of interested in doing across fiction and nonfiction, just doing something that's new, doing something that breaks the boundaries of your typical true crime podcast or something like that.
As a voice actor and a voice actor who's attached to Voice 123, I've simply got to ask you this question. And I'll fire it at you, Al. How important is voice acting and voiceover in your doing what you do?
It depends on the story, but we've used it at least in the past 5 podcasts that I've made. We've used voice actors, and the most interesting realm that I'm most excited about is in translations, and that is something that I hope we continue to do more of. We recently did a show where we did an investigation of a missing persons case in the Indian Himalayas.
Yeah.
We were able to gain access to interrogation tapes of the 2 main suspects. They were all in Hindi, but we had the real tapes and we were able to bring on voice actors that in a way you could hear part of the real tape and then we dubbed over with voice actors and you were able to kind of recreate this really intense scene and put music over it. It was just powerful. It brought forward a whole new layer of the story. But something else we've done too is we have put together a French podcast. It was called Le Monstre. And our host and investigator spoke both English and French, but he did about 60% of the interviews in English and 40% of them in French. But what we were able to do is we were able to put out a full French podcast and a full English podcast because we dubbed over the 40%, with English and the other part with French. And, not only is it exciting that a wider audience and other, native speakers are able to hear these stories, but it's so much fun getting to work with voice actors like yourself. You guys bring such a unique layer to the story And I mean, your voice is brilliant. There's so many other voices out there that
I
are
was
so engaging. I think because it's audio only, a great voice can sucker you in,
yeah,
like, oh man, if you buy an audiobook and the voice is not right, even though the book's great, you're not there, it's
yeah.
hard to stay hooked. But even if it's not your favorite story in the world and the voice is fantastic, you'll sit and listen. I think there's something to that. I know Meredith also works with
I work
voice
with voice
actors.
actors
Yes.
every single episode, especially for the podcast that I host. So when you ask that question, I'm like, so important. And also, I'm like, as an audio purist, resistant to using any sort of AI for voices at this point in my career. And I'm constantly casting, finding new voices. And yes, seconding Alex, you have a fantastic voice. If you ever want to do voice acting for me, I would love that.
How important do you think this AI voiceover development is, and what impact is it going to have on what you do?
I mean, I think that like any AI advancement, it's an inevitable move in every
Yes.
field. It's going to infiltrate every part of, you know, basically every job, but entertainment, as we're talking about in podcasting, it'll be there and it'll be a helpful tool in some ways. And I think in other ways, it'll be a question like, is this something we should use here? Is this something better suited to, you know, people? And I think that's just a case by case thing to discuss. And that's kind of how we've treated it too. And like, so for the podcast I do, we've decided no AI, no AI voices, all people. It's a certain quality. And one day I'm sure AI voices will be, you can't even tell. And I guess when we get there, we'll see. But we have an old school radio vibe for the show
Yeah.
that I'm working on. And that just requires a human touch.
Yes. It's interesting you should say that, because I got into voiceover and got developed an absolute audio purist fascination for audio when, as a child, I listened to a BBC production of John Wyndham's famous science fiction novel, The Day of the Triffids. And I'll never forget it. It was absolutely fascinating. And I remember thinking as a 14-year-old, I want to do that. So I
And
think
you
there's a great deal to be said for audio. And I think you're right, Alex, in the sense that chat shows should be video, because one needs to be able to follow conversations and see facial expressions. Let me throw this at both of you, and then I'll see who picks it up first. But how do you envisage creators expanding the podcast experience beyond the episodes themselves to deepen audience engagement?
Yeah, building a bit of that audience loyalty, that always checking in. I think, it's with our limited series, it's definitely tricky, but I think something like Payne does really well is he's always teasing an audience on social media. Like an episode ends and you are hungry for that little breadcrumb that he's left at the end. And then, in to keep you engaged week by week before the next episode comes, he's dropping just a little bit of what you might get in the next episode on his social feed. He's writing hints, and then that's getting shared around on social media. The word's getting spread more. I think it's creating more suspense, more hype. But I think that kind of just playfulness in social media, and always just like recognizing, what does your audience want? What are they hungry for right
Yeah.
now? I think social media is going to be the way to keep building that up. What do you think, Meredith?
Yeah, my brain went to social media immediately in terms of like outside of the podcast feed. I do think there's other things like bonus episodes and subscriber bases, things like Patreon and places where you can really interact with like a hardcore fan base that I think is also an answer to that question. But I think the most common thing, it's social media, it's companion videos, it's clips from the podcast that intrigue new listeners to follow you and to see the next thing that you're doing. And I think that like just the trick to it is different for every single project. For me, it's like, what's going to show people the vibe of your show? What's going to make people feel like, ooh, I want to drop into that space and listen for 30 minutes to an hour. What is the branding there? How does it feel? especially if it's just an audio thing. You kind of want to create like a feel to it as well, which is why like I think cover art's so important and things like that. I think they actually can't be undervalued because they're like your initial impression before you click play.
As a final question to the two of you, right? Let me start with you, Alex. Where is podcasting going, do you think? What are we going to see? What sort of innovation are we going to see?
I think it's going to YouTube. Which
Okay.
is so weird to say because I feel like YouTube for me was so 2005 to 2010 and bloggers from 2010 to 2014, like, man, I was a huge Casey Neistat fan. I think that's one of the reasons I picked up a camera and learned how to edit was his videos. And I think about like his videos, and if they had been streamed together as like 6 concurrent episodes, could he have just put them out as audio? I'm like, I think he could have. So in my mind, I'm like, I almost think we're going to come full circle back to that, where it's going to be I want to see it first. And then, it's shared around on everything else with clippables and stuff. And then the audio will almost be a concurrent secondary thing. But I think it's going to come back to being video first, if it's not already.
And you as an audio purist, Meredith?
Well, I do think Alex has a point there. I do think
That
now
isn't
it's
the point. The fact that he has a point
right.
isn't the point.
I mean, I think there's always going to be people that are commuting, and I think that's
Yes.
a big listener base for podcasts. And when it first popped off too, it's like people on the train, people in their cars, and for many years due to COVID, we weren't really seeing that. And those are the years where podcasts on YouTube started to rise. So I think there's always still going to be a split and a want to have some sort of audio form because it kind of was born out of people in their cars and people on the subway and stuff like that. So I do think that will continue to exist. But yeah, I think we're going to maybe see changes in the user interface, which I think is really what Alex is pointing to.
Yeah.
I don't know if that we have the perfect, these are things way above our pay grade, but the perfect apps and like the perfect platforms for everything a podcast can be right now. And so I think maybe we'll start to see them converge in places like YouTube where you can just listen to audio or you could watch it on video and you kind of can pick and choose what works for you and where you are at that moment. But yeah, I think it'll be like some changes in the technological space around the content. I think the content will always be experimenting and some of the stuff that works will just continue on being what it is. But I think the tech is going to change. And I'm actually looking forward to that because right now everything's kind of all over the place. You can listen in 1,000 different places. And I'm not sure what's best.
Yeah, I think that goes the same with like the terminology. Like we don't really have language to describe. I mean, we do, I think, as like people inside the industry, but I don't think like a wider audience understands when we say what an always on is, like
Yeah.
I explain limited series, like I said earlier, someone on the street, they have no idea. I think those maybe will come up with words to define what these different subsectors of podcasts are, and then it'll be clear. But I think that's going to come, like Meredith said, probably from the technology first. The technology has to provide it for the user so they understand the genres.